afternoon in compliance with the letter from the clerk that was dated 28th of November 2023. The aforementioned invitation required me to respond to the question of private notice number 19 of 2023 and also extended leave to provide policy positions as appropriate. In the section immediately below, I have therefore responded to the question.
Minister, I want us to deal with this question because of the heavy calendar I have in the next 45 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
That will include a myriad of supplementaries.
Thank you.
And joy riding.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I beg to respond as follows. In Part 1, maintenance of public roads is funded by the Road Maintenance Levy Fund, commonly known as fuel levy. The allocation of funds collected from the fuel levy is implemented in accordance with the legislation enacted by this august House. In particular, the Kenya Roads Act 1999, Section 6(2) D and E stipulates percentage allocation out of the funds as follows. 22% is allocated equally to all constituencies in the country to be administered by the Rural Roads Authority. 10% of the allocated funds is allocated for the maintenance or development of link roads between constituencies and serve as a government counterpart funds in funding work on rural roads to be administered by the Kenya Rural Roads Authority, and that the said percentum shall be equally distributed to the constituencies where Kenya Rural Authority has a mandate. 40% of the allocated funds is allocated in respect of national roads to be administered by National Roads Highway Authority. 15% of the allocated funds is allocated in respect of the urban roads to be administered by Urban Roads Authority. 1% of the allocated funds is allocated in respect of roads in national parks and reserves to be administered by the Kenya Wildlife Service. A maximum of 2% of the allocated fund is allocated in respect of the recurring expenditure of the board, and administration of the balance of 10% is in accordance with the road sector investment program approved by the Ministry of Roads. With reference to KERA, which was the subject of the question, members will note that the allocation of 32% of fuel levy, which is earmarked for rural roads, is distributed, and Mr. Speaker, with emphasis, is distributed equally to the concerned constituencies. The 10% of the fuel levy funds mentioned under Section 6 of the Kenya Roads Act is allocated to address, among others, emergencies and security roads. The Constituency Roads Committee, which have appointees of the national government CDF and the patronage of the honorable members, are valuable instruments in ensuring equity and optimal use of fuel levy at the constituency level. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, it is clear that the roads maintenance levy is distributed equally. It therefore means that every honorable member here is superintending and oversighting in this financial year, Mr. Speaker, an amount herein provided which is of the 22% in each and every of the 290 constituencies. We have 44,522,070. In the 10%, Mr. Speaker, you have 20,237,305. As a matter of fact, and for the record of this House, this financial year, every constituency in the Republic of Kenya, without any discrimination, receives 64 million shillings, 759,375. Mr. Speaker, let me now turn to development vote. Turning to the development vote, Mr. Speaker, budgetary allocation to various projects are processed through the annual budgetary cycle culminating in appropriation by the National Assembly. This budget preparation cycle includes detailed scrutiny by the Appropriation Committee of the National Assembly. It is notable that appropriations under the development vote are project specific, and once approved by Parliament, the ministry stands guided and instructed to implement the same. The initial budget allocation proposal for the development vote are generated by agencies of the ministry, taking into account the following parameters. Top priority is given to completion of ongoing projects, which is also a requirement under the Public Finance Management Act. Availability of fiscal space for new projects, government policies and strategic directions concerning infrastructure development taken together with technical and economic feasibility, equity and regional balance. Mr. Speaker, therefore, there is another category, and I wish honorable members can help me appreciate this point, Mr. Speaker, because it's the cause of so many of the questions that either come to my office privately or as generated by members of parliament in this chamber or are as addressed by members of parliament in public square. There is another category of projects which come about as a result of constitutional imperatives and public participation as guided by parliament. Mr. Speaker, projects arising from public participation process are implemented by KERA largely without modification to the priorities selected and approved by parliament. Through this distinguished house, I hope to make it clear to the public that such projects are entirely consistent with fairness and due process and should not be ascribed to any deficit of equitable allocation of projects by KERA. Mr. Speaker, turning to the tender notice published by Kenya Rural Roads Authority. And Mr. Speaker, I will be coming back to this issue of public participation funds that are appropriated every year by Parliament, including how much was appropriated this financial year and how this has become a matter of immense contention, despite the fact that it's the honorable members of this chamber who approve these resources. Mr. Speaker, turning to the tender published by the Kenya Rural Roads Authority on 29 September 2023, serious misunderstanding and misinterpretation of the notice appeared in various fora. I am grateful to for this opportunity, Mr. Speaker, to set the record straight for this distinguished House. Allow me to mention 5 key points, Mr. Speaker, at which the public were misled when the tender notice by KERA was taken in isolation as evidence of iniquity. First, Mr. Speaker, the tender contained projects that are based on termination and retendering. KERA, in implementing various development vote projects, has encountered a number of non-performing contractors. After repeated efforts to revive the affected projects failed, it was found necessary to terminate the projects. Permission has been obtained from the Attorney General to wind up the projects and conduct fresh tendering to enable continuation of the projects. For avoidance of doubt, there are other similar terminated projects for which replacement contractors will be sought through open tenders even in the future. Number 2, Mr. Speaker, is the inclusion of public participation projects. Public participation projects are identified, Mr. Speaker, and approved by Parliament before being handed over to KERA for implementation, at which point the tenders are advertised. Extraction of public participation projects from the procurement notice without background and origin being made clear and use of the same comparisons, which projects funded by other sources, leads to invalid conclusions. The projects are distributed across the country in line with the principle of public participation and other constitutional imperatives considered and determined by this House. The question, therefore, as to whether it is just, fair, or equitable is not better answered by the Cabinet Secretary. Indeed, Mr. Speaker, it is better answered by this House. And Honorable Mbui, being a distinguished leader in this House for 2 terms, has a better answer than Cabinet Secretary or any other person, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in fact, Mr. Speaker, since the budget is itemized to specific roads, Mr. Speaker, the ministry or its agencies cannot for sure establish where the roads are located. Mr. Speaker, for the last 5 years, the fund distributed by this House through these mechanisms is in the knowledge of this House. And therefore, Mr. Speaker, I would like to say for this financial year, This very chamber, this very house, Mr. Speaker, budgeted a sum total of 21 billion shillings, which is far higher than the money allocated to KERA under road maintenance levy through the RMLF. So if the distribution of these resources, Mr. Speaker, to various agencies as budgeted is unfair, then neither KERA nor the ministry will be blamed, because we are constitutionally bound to implement the decisions of this House without injecting a scintilla of doubt, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the third indicator of the projects that were advertised is where we have cases of emergency, like the situation with El Nino. The ministry allocated resources either from the emergency fund or other sources to address these emergencies. The emergencies arise as works are tendered by any road agency for purpose of repair. Those activities are specific to network reinstatement, to the geographical location in question, and generalized comparisons with other counties, for example, are not valid. Such projects also include security roads aimed at improving security operations. Where we have cases of emergency, like in the case of El Nino, the ministry will allocate resources either from the contingency fund or from other sources, including those budgeted by this House. Such allocation shall not be misconstrued to mean unfair allocation of resources, because they will be addressing, Mr. Speaker, what in law is called force majeure, or otherwise known as the act of God. Fourth, Mr. Speaker, is the aggregated funding towards constituency roads identified by Constituent Roads Committee. Mr. Speaker, a number, and this is important also for emphasis, Mr. Speaker, a number of the Constituency Roads Committee have gained experience, have found that it is best to combine various approved budgetary allocation into one bigger project, which is tendered as one package. Mr. Speaker, the consequence of this approach was that the size of the project tends to exceed the regional threshold of 10 million, which necessitates KERA to conduct the procurement at a national level. It can be seen that if these aggregated initiatives are extracted in isolation from their procurement notice and used in general comparison with CRCs, which have not adopted the same approach, errors would result, Mr. Speaker. The notorious constituencies for which type of costs are those that are in urban and peri-urban areas, such as Kikuyu constituency, where the majority leader, Mr. Speaker, comes from. When the adverts appear nationally, people tend to question why are these areas having been considered with big projects, when in reality they have aggregated their resources to one project, Mr. Speaker, and like many other constituencies, especially in rural areas, which receive equal amounts to the same constituencies, but choose to allocate them to projects of less than 10 million shillings, and therefore advertised at the regional level. So, Mr. Speaker, some of the members of parliament here guiding their constituency roads committee decide that instead of funding roads of less than 10 million shillings, they aggregate their money to 20, to 30, to 40, and decide that it be advertised at the national level by KERA because of the constitutional and legal imperatives for advertisement. As a result, you will find, for example, Kikuyu constituency, in the advert that was shared by Honorable Mbui, they are there advertising a project, but the other constituencies across the country, where they advertise their roads below 10 million, cannot appear in the advert because they will appear in the regional advert where these advertisements occur. And again, Mr. Speaker, taking it in isolation would appear as though one constituency is getting more than the other, yet it is just about how those resources are being utilized by the constituency. Mr. Speaker, it is, Mr. Speaker, 50 is misinterpretation of project cost as an annual budget. And this is where, again, the question of Honorable Mbui, Mr. Speaker, is extremely important. Part of the misinformation associated with KERA notice number of 29th September 2023 Mr. Speaker, is insinuation that the multi-year global cost estimate for various projects was in fact a budget allocation for a single year, and thus an indication of a skewed allocation of scarce resources. While this incorrect interpretation is easily detected and corrected through cross-reference to approved budgets by this House and approved annual road work plans, I take this opportunity to once again assure the House that the allegations of skewed resource allocation was utterly without basis. In fact, Mr. Speaker, I have been baffled by the utterances by both inside and outside these chambers by elected representatives of the people who have been given enormous mandate and responsibility to do this sacred duty of distributing the public resources, Mr. Speaker, to turn around the whole world, either feign ignorance, Mr. Speaker, on the public, or Mr. Speaker,
Order, honorable members.
or Mr. Speaker.
Yes, Robert Mbui, what is out of order?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker,
He's answering your question, remember?
Mr. Speaker, I do agree, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, you know that this is a question that I raised in the House Business Committee that you chair. And we agreed as a House that instead of talking about it, even in this chamber, Mr. Speaker, because I had wanted to seek for your permission to do an adjournment motion, we agreed that we ask the CS so that he can come and clarify. Mr. Speaker, is the CS in order to lecture members of Parliament? And I want to say what he has said, that he is baffled by utterances, both inside and outside these chambers, Mr. Speaker, by elected representatives of the people who have been given a mandate to turn around the whole world and either feign ignorance or deliberately mislead the public. Mr. Speaker, is the CS allowed to say such words in this House? Mr. Speaker, the CS has to withdraw that statement and apologize to this House.
He is answering your question. Let him finish. You will interrogate him.
Mr. Speaker.
Minister, order. Order, honorable members. I have brought the minister for you to grill him on whatever you want. That grilling and questioning excludes shouting at the minister. So listen to him. When he finishes, everybody will have an opportunity to ask questions which I shall compel him to answer. But let's have some decorum in the House. Minister, try and paraphrase your answer.